I got to admit, guys, this is a great venue. I've really enjoyed the conversations. They've been very relevant to our background. Precima's been a bit of a quiet company in the tech industry in Toronto, but we've been around for 10 years. Effectively, we're a startup that's actually part of the Loyalty One brand and banner. We've been actually focused on actually bringing great data science to the retail industry and started that 10 years ago as a consulting company. 4 years in, we realized we're repeating the same thing for multiple companies across Canada, US, and into Europe, and effectively we reinvented ourselves into a product company. It's been a great experience. I love the conversations this morning talking about data intelligence. We've struggled and we built a data science practice that's about 25 people. We're a 260-person company right now that stretches right from Den Bosch in the Netherlands all the way back to Toronto, which is our headquarters. And it's a continual growth kind of world. So this year we've actually decided to start getting back into the community and making sure that we're a known entity, I'll say. It is a reality. This is a growing kind of space. We'd love to contribute back and collaborate with people that are in the B2B space. Our solutions really are actually in that space to helping the retailers. I'm not sure everybody must have heard about Whole Foods being bought by Amazon. That is a kind of shattering, kind of disruptive effect that's actually happening in retail. And we're helping those retail customers that are trying to figure out they themselves, how do we go from being a brick and mortar, bringing groceries or bringing clothing into a space and not yet having the science by which to make those decisions on. So our focus in offering a SaaS platform and a solution is to globally be able to help those companies which are great operating logistics, retail-based entities, compete in a new way that the world is actually working. So Precima's continuing to grow, continuing to look for both collaborations in the B2B space, but certainly also continuing to have great conversations with people that help us with following into the disruption that's actually happening in our retail world. If there's any questions, be happy to answer one or two. Call it out.
What's your biggest hiring challenge?
Actually, right now is where we're actually working is actually not in the science where we've been doing that for so long. The biggest challenge is how do we bring decision making into a full workflow and actually helping the clients actually understand are those decisions being effective and actually tying them back to their operations. So that actually really comes back to pure application development right now, pure application engineering, front end, back end kind of considerations. That's certainly a big one. One last question. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks. Oh, one last question. You got it.
Does your services cover all industries or just retail?
Just retail. The biggest focus for us, and again, I think a couple of the folks that talked about what to be really good at in B2B is pick something that you want to be a specialist in. So us, it's really a focus on high volume, low margin kind of retail world, and those that have really probably been around for a long time. That's really our focus right now. Okay, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. It's great for us to get a chance to have some companies that have really done a great job of supporting Tech Week Toronto. Obviously, the way that we work as a company is while we may be based in Chicago, everything we do in terms of building content, sponsorship, community partners, executive advisory board is done here. So we ask everyone in the Canadian ecosystem to tell us, who do you actually want on stage? Who do you want to hear from? We are not the experts. We are simply a conduit, and we look to you guys to give us the feedback. So I appreciate all of the ability that you guys have done in terms of supporting, showing, asking questions, and really bringing some interesting companies to light. So thank you to that, and thank you to Precima for being one of those supporters. So we're going to go ahead and introduce the next fireside chat. Let me tell you a little bit about our moderator. Michael Cousset is one of the heads of business development at the Toronto Stock Exchange, and he also leads the Toronto Venture Exchange. In this capacity, he develops and directs Exchange's global strategy for attracting new technology IPOs and growing the tech sector. He also works closely with founders, private company executives, and their shareholders as they explore their options for raising growth capital. In addition, Mr. Cousset has been involved with several corporate and strategic strategic initiatives for the exchange, including reviewing and executing acquisitions, joint ventures, and a broad range of organic growth opportunities. Prior to that, he spent 16 years as an investment banker in the Toronto office of a leading global investment bank where he advised corporate boards, managed teams, and cross-border IPOs. So he's very experienced with dealing with these larger companies, which is great because we've got a repeat founder coming up for an excellent discussion. So we'll bring Mr. Gosset.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. I'm really excited for this session. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time for a whole bunch of reasons. As you heard in the introduction, I get this really neat role in the capital markets, leading the tech practice at the stock exchange. And because we run two stock exchanges, one for small companies and one for big companies, I get the chance to truly talk to startups to unicorns and seeing the full gamut of it. And what's going on in Canada right now is absolutely amazing. We've got some really good companies being built, funded, growing in this country, and some fantastic entrepreneurs, one of whom is sitting with me today. And so as we get into the conversation with Mike, I want to sort of tap into his wealth of experience on some of the challenges founders face in terms of moving from being a startup to truly legit companies and how to successfully disrupt. So, Mike, let's start things off with the question, or with some very basic questions sort of around your background. Currently founder, CEO of League. In 30 seconds or less, what the heck is League?
So we like to say that we're dragging the insurance industry out of the Stone Ages. We're completely reimagining the health insurance market, and we're a health benefits or health insurance provider.
Okay, so already we're hearing something about disruption because major incumbents in the space would include Sun Life and Manulife and some
100-year-old companies.
100-year-old companies that you're going up against. Prior to that, you went up against some other pretty big companies. Talk just briefly about some of the life at Kobo and things like that.
Yeah, so Kobo was a global digital book platform. Our major competitor was Amazon. When we started, Amazon was about a 6 to 9 month head start on us. There was Sony, there was other players in the market. We eventually figured out a way to be number one or number two in every market, competing against Amazon. We bought the Sony business for basically for $1, and a bunch of other ones we scooped up and found a way to be on the podium, so to speak.
So you've disrupted and fought against Amazon and done really well. You're fighting now against the 100-year-old insurance companies and doing really well. Just a couple more things on League for those who don't know. How many employees roughly, capital raised, just a few of those key metrics? Yeah,
so we're about 120, 130 employees today, about 2.5 years old, and we've raised, call it 30 million US.
Good, for some pretty big names. So well done. All right, so we've got someone here who knows how to disrupt and how to fight against some incumbents. I want to start with a bit of a sort of fundamental question, which is, as you look at building companies, there's a few elements to it. One is having the great idea, and the other is actually turning that idea into something that does disrupt. What are the challenges? What's the biggest challenge you've seen from moving from that idea to something truly disruptive?
Yeah, so in my experience, it really has never been, the specific idea or the specific invention. It's really all been about putting, a team on the field that can compete and win against whoever the Goliath is. So a great example is at Kobo, and I do this today with League. I knew exactly who Bezos's direct reports were on the Kindle team. And I looked at my people and how they stacked up and where I was weak versus where I was strong and where I could edge out or come out with an advantage. And I do the same thing with any competitor. So building that team and how you deploy that team on the field, and specifically, what kind of plays you run, not to use too many sports analogies, but if you're playing the same plays that they are with a bigger balance sheet, a giant brand, a giant business, and a lot more people, you're going to lose every time. So you need to figure out how to assemble that team, and then how to put plays together that it's just really hard to compete with, regardless of what your balance sheet, your brand awareness, and your customer base is.
So maybe we can just drill into that a little bit more, because you've made it sound easy, but it can't be. As you're a startup with 100 employees or even smaller, and you're trying to compete against the Amazons, the playbook may sound great, but I can get a job with Amazon. I can get a job with Apple. That sounds really good. So how does the startup or the smaller growth stage company actually really do that?
Yeah, listen, I think there's a number of components. In the early days, it has a lot to do with, the scope, scale, excitement of your vision and what you're trying to do. Getting very quickly to build the next sales app or the next marketing app or the next whatever app. Not a lot of people get excited about that, especially considering most of us don't use that many more new apps anymore. But the idea of disrupting a multi-trillion-dollar industry and going after that, even though you don't know exactly how, and it's really up to the ingenuity of your team and the people that you bring in, partners, investors, et cetera. That is a big part of getting people, excited, involved in the very early days. And I remember, and I can think of this with League for sure, in the early days pitching and going to some of the big insurance companies or trying to pull somebody from the industry that had an innovation streak, but was but knowledgeable at the industry, but could be a great ad for us. And the general response was like, are you kidding me? Why would I do that, right? I've got a great gig going here. I'm going to get to that next level in my giant 30-step corporate ladder. Why would I ever leave? And what starts to happen over time as you continue to grind it out is you start to win, the 10,000, the 100,000, the million, the 10 million, the $100 million deal, and all of a sudden you look really legit all of a sudden. So there's a lot of grinding between, vision and, ultimate reality and getting people to start to come on board.
Okay, I'm going to go down that path in a couple minutes, but I just want to conclude with maybe one more thought around the people side of things. In tech in particular, there's a lot of movement. Sure, in the old businesses you're trying to dislocate, you may stay with Sun Life for 25 years or 30 years as an employee. But in tech, folks move around really quickly, particularly in the Valley, but also in Toronto. So how do you deal with that? Is that actually a good thing? Are you comfortable with that? Or what do you try to do to maybe nurture folks so they do stay with you for more than a couple of years?
Yeah, so listen, I think it's a competitive market, and it's certainly more competitive for talent, and the idea of talent hopping is more typical outside of this particular market. But I think it really comes down to culture, and culture is not the what or the why, but it's the how. The how you work, and really it kind of defines who's in the building with you and who's on the mission with you, and picking people literally not necessarily by their particular skills, but picking people for the team that really fit the culture and the how you want to compete. It pays dividends in so many different ways. One of them is, of course, actually competing, but the outcome of that is hopefully more winning than losing, and that generally drives people to stick around.
Okay. All right. So we've sort of spent a bit of time here talking about the people side of things and how important it is. A few minutes ago, you talked about some of the steps you've taken to try to move a business, any of the businesses you've run, from startup to a more legitimate company. Let's just dig down into some of that a bit more. I want to talk maybe about, first of all, winning your first customer. You're a startup. You're trying to win your first customer, and there's only 5 people in your office. You're doing everything. You are making the coffee, you're coding, you're trying to close the sale, and you're trying to convince this major customer you're actually legit. How do you do that?
Yeah, so listen, I think it's different for me today to answer that question than maybe me 10 or 20 years ago. I think the answer you want is me 20 years ago, because me now, there's not too many CEOs that I can't get to, and there's not too many investors or board members that I can't get to. For sure in Canada, parts of the U.S., California, New York. I'm not any help in Wisconsin or other parts of the country, maybe a bit in Illinois too. But, listen, me 10 or 20 years ago, it was sheer grit and determination and doing everything and anything to get that customer's attention and to make that customer feel that I wasn't selling them stuff. It was more that I was there to become the kind of partner that they didn't have. And if I think of the early Kobo days or Zip2 days when Kimball and Elon and I were schlepping around Palo Alto in this shitty Honda Accord that was painted green with yellow polka dots, don't ask. It was about being the partner that they didn't have, and being relevant to them outside the specific thing that we had today, because we all knew that the thing was going to change. But being a partner and providing a bigger value proposition, that was attractive.
Do you find it's easier or harder to do this in Canada than the US?
To do this? Listen, I think it depends. I think the Canadian market is far less competitive overall, right? How many banks do we have? How many retailers do we have? A big difference in the U.S. market beyond the size and just overall scale of it is there's a lot more than 3 grocery stores, right? There's a lot more than 3 retailers, a lot more than 3 banks, and they're all looking for an edge. And there's a great stat, which is, how much money do Canadian businesses spend on technology as a percentage of total revenues or as a percentage of GDP compared to the U.S.? The U.S. leads, right? Israel, which is a tiny country, leads. We lag. So I think that's a hard thing about doing it here, is that when you're starting, you need a customer. And what better customer than the person that you know down the street, or a friend that knows a friend that has a mother that is the CEO of something? Like that's like your easiest way. But if they're just not willing buyers, or as willing as the guy or new CEO of PepsiCo that is she's looking for edge, and you've got a way to provide her edge, she's going to listen. So I think that makes it easier south of the border. But I think overall, between incubators, accelerators, angel investors, seed stage funds, events like this, a community, like when I started out, there were, to use the Gretzky analogy, there were no shots on net. There was Nortel. And then, 10 years later, there was BlackBerry. Well, now there's literally thousands of companies, not only between Toronto and KW, but in Vancouver and, in Ottawa. And Shopify is a great example of causing a resurgence in Ottawa. And so I think those things make it easier today than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But the competitiveness of the market and the willingness to get edge from this new startup, regardless if it was 3 people, in a van or whatever, it's just not the same here.
Okay. One of the things that I think I see a lot when I talk to startups is, their desire to get to the U.S. quickly because of the customer base is so much bigger, as you mentioned a moment ago. And then they start to have ambitions sometimes in other regions. I want to get to the U.S. and a core market for me is going to be Germany, and then I'm going to go to Asia. And can you scale too quickly? Can you spread yourself too thin? And did you ever kind of face that challenge either at Kobo or League or any of the other stuff you've done in your Polkadot cars?
Yeah, so every time I've tried to scale too fast, it's like a deficiency, like in my DNA or something. Listen, I don't know where it came from, but I think for me, I discovered this very straightforward concept that in technology, you are never going to be the number one company in, pick one of those countries, Germany, Italy, Canada. We're too small. You could do it in China or the US, but everywhere else you can't. So if you want to be on the podium, and tech with positive spiral economics kind of favors 2 to 3 winners, usually 2, and nobody remembers number 3, you have to be thinking from the start to go outside your market. And I remember the conventional wisdom, and I'm sure this is still often talked about in places like Y Combinator or various accelerators and incubators, get it right in your home market and then start to go out. Well, Kobo is a great example. League is a good example. Critical Path, the one before that, where we just went global at once. And the market with League, it's giant here, right? If I count the employer-sponsored part of the market, okay, so it's $40 billion. The overall employer-sponsored part across the U.S. and Canada, it's $1 trillion. I can get to probably $2 or $3 trillion by throwing in Europe and parts of Asia, and that's been a bit of a challenge here because there is a bit of a tendency to say, shit, it's really big here. Why don't we just keep doing this? But then you launch in Chicago, and you're like, whoa, this market is the whole Chicago. Just the city and Chicagoland is bigger than all of Canada for our particular market. And that's not just people, right? Because Toronto is, I think, bigger from a people standpoint, or the GTA. It's that my particular category, health insurance, health benefits, it's way more costly And there's way more money being spent in the US than there is here.
Is it easier to disrupt in Chicago or in LA or in wherever if you're physically there? Do you find you need to set up a League Chicago office and have a bunch of Sox fans or Cubs fans running around?
Come on. Yeah, listen, I think yes. And there's different schools of thought, and I've in a company, in a lifetime of company, I've kind of gone between I've done the accordion thing, like, oh, we need people local. Screw local, we need people central. No, we need central and local. So I think you do go through a balancing act to figure out what is the right kind of mix, but healthcare, publishing content, think of all the different businesses that I've been in, there's an intensely local feel that if you care about edge, I think you need some of that local component.
All right, so you've talked a few times about having an edge, finding an edge. Are there cases where disrupting, though, actually doesn't mean truly disrupting and competing against the incumbents, going to that 100-year-old company and saying, we're going to squash you, but instead saying the way we're going to win is by partnering with you? And I've seen this perhaps in traditional fintech, if you will, where for the first 3 or 4 years, it was all about taking down the big 5 banks. And then folks realized maybe we can actually make the big 5 banks stronger by partnering with them and in the process make ourselves better.
Is this being recorded?
It may be. There's cameras.
Listen,
over
I think
there.
we're all frenemies, right? I among this group of friends, I will say we are going to fucking squash the insurance companies, but I will walk out of here and say, I really want to be partners with you and find a way to make this work. Think of me as that valued partner that, you're not going to get from fill in the blank IT company. So I think in fintech, health tech, insure tech, whatever tech, distribution is a challenge. And that's actually, in most sectors, the incumbents typically have it and you typically don't. Some have said that in fintech or insurance, it's even harder, right? Because you look at insurance, it's generally broker dominated, right? So you have this built-in network of people that are your sales force. They're not quite captive, but they're pretty close. So we actually thought initially, well, we'll want to be friends with some of the insurance companies because we have this awesome new thing and they've got this big distribution network. It actually turned out for us that there's a different reason to be friends or frenemies, but their distribution network is not one of them. And the distribution network has been selling the same stuff in the same way and the same attitude that who cares about the end consumer, who cares about prevention and keeping you healthy. Those are nice words, but we just sell you this piece of paper and these little booklets that you hand out.
Okay, being frenemies. So we've got about 10 minutes to go. I believe somewhere there's a fancy iPad with questions being curated. Anyone know where that is? It's being charged. Okay.
Stand up and yell.
Stand up and yell. No, well, what I was going to say is I will go to audience questions in a couple of minutes, but I want to cover 2 more topics with you first, Mike. First topic I want to talk about is the differences between Canadians or Canada and the US. You've worked in the Valley, you've worked here, you've seen some of those. And then the second thing I want to talk about for a few minutes is capital, getting capital, how difficult or easy it's been. Let's first talk about the distinction between Canadians and the US and some of the subtle or not so subtle things you've seen around founders in both markets.
So I'll pick one experience that has kind of stuck with me, and that is an experience of just landing in Hong Kong with my new partner, who is the CEO, and I ran everything else. And this was a company that sold into telecom as the world was going to smartphones and mobile data was the thing. And we landed, and Mark, he runs global sales for SAP. He said to me, "Let's go for a run." And I was like, "Dude, I am tired." It was a 12-hour flight. It's like, "Come on, we're going for a run." And then we're meeting with the CEO of something and the CEO of something else, and boom, 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 and it was like till midnight. We were packed in a bunch of stuff, and we're going for a run. And as we're going for a run, the last K of the run, he starts to pick up the pace. And I'm like, I'm dying here. I'm not a runner. I'm built to be a linebacker, not a runner. And he starts picking up the pace. And so I start picking up the pace. And he starts picking up the pace even more. And so I got to do that too. And now he starts throwing elbows. And I'm like, are you kidding me? He wants to win. He is just that competitive and to the point of aggression. And I don't see as much of that here. I think it's totally changing. I think there's a new generation of founders that have kind of watched the movies and been to the so-called rodeo. There's just not as much of it.
So both Mike and I are involved in a group that hopefully all of you know about called C100, which is a group out in the Valley that serves as a really key bridge between Canada and the US for startups and growth stage companies. And one of the stories we hear a lot from them is the sort of stereotypical Canadian entrepreneur goes and makes the pitch down on Sand Hill Road, and they talk about the size of their market and saying, we've got an amazing opportunity, our addressable market is $5 billion. And that Canadian founder is really excited by a $5 billion market. The exact same founder who carries an American passport walks in the next day and does the same pitch to the same VC and talks about the same market, but describes it as being a $5 trillion market. And we know it's not $5 trillion. It couldn't be, but the arrogance or confidence or attitude, and you pick your favorite noun there or adjective, is one being very different in the US. We were talking a little bit about this outside. I mean, we're generally a $5 billion mindset per country against the $5 trillion of the US. How badly does that hurt us?
So what we also said is, like, the one guy is bullshitting, right? Because it actually is $5 billion, or at least it is right then. And what I would say there is, like, never let facts get in the way of a good story, right? You are selling. You are selling. It is a $1 trillion market. And if they start to ask you to break that down, then you start, you got to do some dancing. But it is a $1 trillion market, and you've got to use both excitement and fear as emotions during the fundraising and sales process, recruiting process. You got to use them to your advantage, because literally you start out with nothing most of the time. There was this great book, and it was comparing Bill Gates, who I have known for many years, Steve Jobs, who I barely knew, Andy Grove, who I knew as a kid, and Larry Ellison. And so kind of the generation of superstar founders that I kind of grew up with. And there was this great description of, you got to know when to play judo and you got to know when to play sumo. I don't know if everybody knows what that means, but essentially you got to know when to use the weight of your opponent, or the inertia of your opponent, or whoever's on the other side of the table, versus when to throw your weight around. And I think early days, you got to start leveraging their weight, but there comes a point where, and at League, we've hit that point where we've got some weight, and it's amazing because you can start to throw it around, and you can start, using your own mass or own weight as a way, not to get to too many physics descriptions, but to start to get and build on your momentum.
Makes sense. The iPad is making its way to me. This is very exciting, isn't it? Yeah. Let's do this together. Any of these that you want? You're going to take number 3.
Follow the rules or break them. Where to draw the line.
Okay. So, Mike, do you follow the rules or break them? And where do you draw the line?
Yeah, listen, I think you're generally breaking them most of the time, and then you get told that you have to start following them in certain places. When you think about, and disruption gets used way too much, right? It's one of those too often used words. But if you are thinking about an industry, value chain structure changing, that by definition is about breaking the rules. And you can't really break them all at once. And certainly some industries like financial services are highly, highly regulated. Healthcare, highly, highly regulated. So there's certain rules that you can't break because you'll go to jail, and you don't want that. And there's other rules that by definition of what you're even doing, and if you're doing it well, you absolutely need to break them.
Okay. If you've got other questions, there's a couple more pouring in, but I'm going to ask the capital question that I promised earlier, and then we'll go back to this. Do keep using the app, guys, to put questions through. So, capital. Getting capital, does it matter whether that money comes from Canada or the US? You've raised on all sides of the border, and I think you've raised internationally as well. Just some thoughts around that for startups and then growth stage companies like yourself.
Yeah, so I've done it on both sides of the border. I've done it in many different ways. I've done angel, I've done venture, I've done institutional, I've done strategic. I personally don't feel like there's one formula. I think you just need to get money, and money is generally money, and people will tell you that certain investors are smarter. I don't really buy into that. I feel like I feel like there's some challenges here, way less than even 5 years ago. There's tons of early stage funds and seed and way more angel investors than there ever used to be. There's not as many later stage funds. And I was talking about this with a fellow founder yesterday at lunch, and he was like, yeah, but if you're later stage and you're doing awesome, people start pouring in. True, that happens, but now think of that situation, right? There's a person there at a fund, let's say on Sand Hill Road, or let's say they're in Boston, either way. That person has all kinds of deals to look at, including yours. If they choose yours, that means they're going to have to come here. And it means when things go wrong, they're not going to know who to call here. And there's all sorts of other risks. So presented with an equally awesome version of you and your company, who is she going to choose, or who is that investor going to choose? I think the odds are not in your favor if it means there's all this other risk. And so we need more later stage funds here, in addition to continue to draw more funds here.
So your last round for League, if I'm not mistaken, was all Canadian or mostly Canadian?
Yeah, it was.
It was all Canadian. And
Yeah.
that was quite different from what you'd seen in prior generations or prior companies you've run.
Yeah, first time I've ever done that.
Yeah, so I think that's a nice vote of confidence for what's happening in Canada.
I don't think you could have done that 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Okay, some really good questions coming through here, and we've got 2 minutes and 35 seconds. So
Faster.
we're going to go really quickly here. This is a neat one. How do you know if you are the right person to scale up an already established small company? And I'll sort of add a little bit more to that. Have you ever fired yourself?
No. No, but I do ask myself that question all the time, right? Like, when is my train leaving the station? Better to ask and answer that question yourself than to be escorted to the train.
Okay. I was going to pursue
How
that
do
a
I
bit
start
more.
my day?
How do you start your day?
What's the best routine when starting your day? I work out because I find that I'm like clearer. I get through a bunch of bullshit while on the treadmill, and generally I am happier and ready to take on whatever shows up at the office. And sometimes meditate.
Last one here. How do you suggest keeping Canadian talent in Canada? Lots of recent grads are moving to the Valley. I'm not sure that's as true today as it was 6 months ago necessarily, or 12 months ago.
Yeah, listen, I don't know what the stats are, but I do know for the first time in my lifetime, there's a real interest, super high interest level among our Prime Minister, his cabinet, the mayor, the province, other mayors, and frankly, every corporate CEO in the country that you care to know around innovation and intellectual property being driven out of Canada and keeping our best and brightest. And a great example of this is we kind of won the lottery to a certain degree on artificial intelligence. And while the rest of the world kind of stopped paying attention, Jeff Hinton and Yoshua Bengio and Rich Sutton kept plowing ahead for 20 years. We jokingly call it the nuclear winter of AI. And all of a sudden, algorithms that were 2% effective became 95% effective, not only to determine cat from dog, but this cancer from that cancer better than a radiologist can. And who shows up all of a sudden? Google, Facebook, Apple, Uber, you name it. Everybody there's an arms race on AI talent. You can't get enough of it. And I know that was one of the other questions. You can't get enough machine learning talent. So there's a great example of like government and corporates stepping in and saying, great, if you are an AI superstar, we want you here, and because we've helped train you and we've helped make you awesome. And now, and I know Google's offering you $700,000 a year, and the university will offer you $150,000, but we'll up your salary, and we want you here. We'll be competitive.
So we've got the red light here suggesting we should be done. Just sort of a parting thought from me, and then I'll ask you to leave some final advice for the audience. I think we're in a really great time for tech. I mentioned that in my opening remarks. We hear a little bit more of the battle cry through the industry in Canada about this being our time. Great founders like Mike and countless ones of his peers who are on the stage today are highlighting exactly this. This new generation of companies is really, really exciting. We've got a lot more to do to continue disrupting, and maybe just from you, Mike, so final final single word of advice, if you can sum something up on what it takes to be a leader and to make sure that Canadian companies like yours continue to be winners.
So no great company gets built by one person. We all stand on the shoulders of giants around us and our team. And so I think that is a mindset that, honestly, not having that prevents a lot of people from thinking bigger and going after, the big win or the bigger exit. Being great at building teams and attracting people to your cause, whether that's investors, a CEO whose son or daughter you went to school with, that you just want her on your team, and just going after her to get her on your team. Like, be relentless in that pursuit of not only viability but just thinking bigger.
Perfect. All right. Please join me in thanking Mike and congratulating him on everything he's done. It's great.
Thank you.